now? Okay. So, so there are 5 supervisors. I work for Sheila Kuehl. She represents the west side of LA from the beach all the way to sort of Los Feliz, almost to downtown, and then on the other side of the Santa Monica Mountains, all of the San Fernando Valley up to Malibu. And I have the great honor of setting her environmental, or working with her to set her environmental policy. And what's really cool is that, for me at least, the other 4 supervisors, for the most part, don't have dedicated environmental deputies. So we need 2 other votes to do anything. We have a $30 billion a year budget. And so we've had an opportunity to do a lot of really cool stuff on environmental issues. So I can start off with those 2 and then talk a little bit about our draft sustainability plan, which is really being handled by Gary Giroux, who's the former president of the Climate Action Reserve, who's now the county's first chief sustainability officer. So it's a very small environmental community in LA, as it turns out. So the first thing I just want to talk a little bit about that we've been able to do that's been pretty cool is create a community choice energy program for the region. I guess one thing to note, sort of backing up a second, is that a lot of the environmental challenges that we face are regional in nature. Air quality, for example, doesn't stop at a municipality's boundaries. The County of Los Angeles has 88 cities in it. Los Angeles City is one of them. It's about half of the population of LA County. 87 other cities make up the rest of that, plus a bunch of unincorporated LA County. And so when you're trying to figure out regional problems, most environmental issues are regional in nature, whether it's water policy, energy policy, climate adaptation, air quality, whatever. It behooves us to be working together as a region. And so there's real opportunity for the county, and other counties for that matter, to be taking more of a leadership role on sustainability and environmental issues. And it's interesting that I'm actually filling in for somebody from the city of LA who couldn't be here today. But it would be 3 people from cities talking about city action, and yet there's this huge gap in terms of what's happening. Counties are doing some work now, but it's really catch up with what the cities are doing. And I think part of that is political, because counties tend to be more conservative than urban cores. And so the political will to do some of this stuff is less there. For example, Orange County has 5 Republican county supervisors. We have 4 Democrats and 1 Republican, and so we can push a lot more through. But anyway, so I think there's a moment that's gonna happen very soon for big counties around the country to start to do a lot of really exciting work that's really important for a regional solution. And so, for example, we've just created a community choice energy program for LA County that also includes Ventura County and 29 cities. So of our 84 cities that are eligible for community choice energy, are you guys familiar with what a community choice energy program is? Okay, so there are 3 investor-owned utilities in California. Ours in this part of the state is SoCal Edison. If you are an Edison customer, you have no choice in terms of who your provider of power is, except for Edison. There was a state law that was passed about a dozen years ago that allowed municipalities to come together and create a new entity to provide an alternative to that investor-owned utility. So Edison customers now in the 31 municipalities that are a part of the Clean Power Alliance have a choice between Edison and the Clean Power Alliance. And we've been able to provide power to those customers less expensively and that's greener at a pretty significant margin. So people are getting less expensive power that's significantly greener than it is under Edison's. And we're rolling out new programs in the next couple of years to incentivize further sort of electrification and decarbonizing buildings and things like that. So that's one cool thing that we've been doing, and I think it often makes sense to do things like that at the regional scale because you can bring in other cities, and San Diego's looking at it. I don't know if you guys are talking to some of your other cities around you, but the more members you have, the cheaper the power you can provide. So there's a lot of efficiencies and scaling opportunities on a lot of this stuff when you branch out from just the city level. So that's one thing that we're working on that's kind of cool. And then the other just sort of example I want to mention is the county just overwhelmingly passed Measure W last fall, which was a stormwater funding measure that will raise $300 million a year for multi-benefit water projects. So green streets that capture and infiltrate, reuse. California's biggest greenhouse gas, the category that creates the most greenhouse gases in California is actually moving water from north to south and east to west. And so the more local we can make our water supply, the better it is from a climate mitigation standpoint. So the county has some goals built into its draft sustainability plan to really increase our local water supplies from a resiliency standpoint, but also from a GHG standpoint. And so this funding measure will pay for large-scale and community sort of distributed green infrastructure projects and provide climate mitigation, climate adaptation benefits, parks, green space, open space, green jobs, and also up to 30 to 50% of our local water supply, will be increasingly local. So those are two sort of big things we're working on. We also have a draft sustainability plan that's out, our first sustainability plan that's out for public review. And what's cool about it is that we've collected data region-wide, and so we can actually share disaggregated data with each of our 88 cities. Most of our cities don't have their own sustainability officers or staff to be doing their own sustainability plans, so we've really created a tool that our smaller cities can use to create their own plans and come up with their own priorities, and sort of leveraging the county's assets and tools. So that's kind of what we're working on.
Thanks, Katy. Tanya, I'd like to come back to you. I have a question. I know that you, while you were working in Mexico City as the Secretary of Environment, you were also working on transportation issues, right? And we kind of touched on that. I'd like to kind of have another round because transportation and traffic is a common issue, a problem that you all share. And I wonder if you could comment on that from work you've done in Mexico City.
So first of all, I think, of course, as Catherine was mentioning, all the environmental issues are totally regional. No, that's 100% true. So something that I think was very positive in the last 6 years is that we coordinated with the federal level, and there was a Comisión Ambiental Megalopolitana, because I know many of you speak Spanish here. So it's like a megapolitan environmental commission that integrates. Before it was only metropolitan, so it was only the city of Mexico and the state of Mexico. And in the last 6 years, it integrates other 4 states. So it really has this regional view, and obviously we started with air quality as a top priority for this. So all the governors would come together every 3 months approximately, sit together to talk about that issue, and the secretaries of environment, we would assess, the governors, no? So I think that was very important because for the first time also, citizens understood that it wasn't Mexico City's problem, that a huge part of the emissions were coming from other states, and that unless we coordinated our efforts, we were not going to be able to keep reducing emissions. And obviously transportation has to do a huge part with those emissions, and that was a very important part of the work, and it has been for several years now in Mexico City. The Ministry of Environment was only responsible for the non-motorized transportation, which is the bicycle infrastructure and promoting bicycle use, which obviously was very important because even though at the beginning, people would say, we're not going to cross the city on a bicycle, which is obvious. But 50% of all the trips done in Mexico City, and I think this must be true in many other cities and megacities as Los Angeles, 50% of the daily trips of the people who live in Mexico City are less than 8 kilometers. So that is where bicycles are very efficient for these shorter trips. And that's why we implemented a very important, or the most aggressive investment in bike infrastructure in the last 6 years, in massive bicycle parking stations, so you can then connect with the metro system or the BRT system. And we implemented bike schools in the summer and every Sunday, where it's amazing. I mean, the amount of people who come with their children, but not only with children, women and adults, to learn to be urban bikers or use the bicycle as an urban transport way of mobility was very impressive. But something that I would like to highlight is that transportation, of course, it has a very strong environmental aspect, but it also has an inclusive aspect that is fundamental, a gender issue that sometimes we leave aside. And then when you're talking about environmental aspects, they're linked to very social important aspects also, as I insist on inclusivity and on gender. And we should not leave that out of the picture, because that obviously is also linked with our ODS objectives. And if you put all that together, it's much easier to get investment and to have the political will to push forward the public policies that you need to.
Cody, can you comment on this?
On transit issues in general? Yeah, ours are very similar, but also different in some ways. I think a lot of ways, we were talking about this ahead of time, I think Mexico City is ahead of us in San Diego. I actually was there recently and rode on one of the trains that had a women and children only car. That was fantastic in a crowded train where you're standing room only maybe and bumping into people. What a comfortable feeling to be able to go in a car with just women and children. It was amazing and so simple. So San Diego, our issues are really around the classic kind of NIMBYism that we've evolved to generate, and it kind of stems from how we've engaged the public over time, where we have community planning groups. In San Diego, we have something like 48 different community areas, and we have planning groups for almost all of them. And it's the same people. We actually just had a study done to show how not diverse or representative of the communities those groups are. And any of you that work in engaging in the community from a government perspective, you know that you're not always hitting the people that are actually living there and doing, living, because they're busy. You're hitting the same squeaky wheels over and over again who come to every public meeting. And so we're really trying to rethink that, because it relates directly to transit, how we plan our communities. And we just, for example, removed parking requirements for new developments that are in high-quality transit areas. And that was a really big step for us to do, and a really big initiative that our mayor took forward. We're calling it, have you all heard of the YIMBY movement? We called it, it's a YIMBY step. Our Republican mayor is now a YIMBY, where we took that action. And of course, you can imagine the outcry we heard around, there's not gonna be parking for anybody, there's gonna be cars everywhere, and they won't find any parking, and oh my God, it's the end of the world. And not thinking about how it's really a market-based decision at that point, where the developer can still choose to build parking if they think that's how they will sell units. It's not that we're not allowing them, it was just we're letting that be a market-based decision rather than requiring so much parking that increases the cost of housing and really prevents the use of transit that is actually available. The other part of that is the biking and walking, and just how to get people out of their cars. We hear all the time that I can't bike here because it's not safe, or I don't, just not. I think there's a couple barriers to that, is getting people to try to do it, which is something we're working on a lot, because that's just a behavior change. And the other piece is actually building real bike lanes that really protect people and make them feel safe. I don't have any answers. It's something that we're slowly tackling and trying to move the needle on, but we haven't succeeded yet.
I just have one quick comment, Katy, and then I'll hand it over to you. One thing that I often comment on, I get to Mexico a lot. My wife is from Mexico. And whenever we go anywhere, we can take a taxi not very far to the Central de Autobuses and go just about anywhere without planning, because there's going to be a bus going where you're going, where you want to go within a half hour, at the worst, an hour, not that long. So the bus system in Mexico, for me, it seems to work very well. Where I live in Ukiah, in Northern California, there's one bus a day that comes by to go to San Francisco, and it's, of course, very inconvenient. It has so many stops. And it just seems like, and I tell my friends that, if we were in Mexico, we'd be seeing buses going by filled with people, and they're comfortable. And, we just don't see that here. It's real, like you said, how do you get people out of their cars? That's going to be a big issue. Sure.
I think that is very important, but there also has to be the political will to implement the public policies to get people out of the car, because voluntarily you're never going to see that happen. I mean, every time we had an ozone crisis, which I think is similar here in LA, where you have higher ozone levels, the media, everybody would just be on top of the mayor saying, like, we need more public transport. And then, of course, the last BRT line he did was in Reforma, which is like the major emblematic street in Mexico City with the whole financial area. And all the neighbors were like, no, we don't want a BRT line here. So, that's something you have to deal with, and you have to really push forward, because, or else you're not going to get people out of the cars.
Okay, Katy, you get to say how LA is dealing with transportation.
Well, I think we're all sort of grappling with similar issues, similar challenges, and LA County recently passed Measure M, which is a half-cent sales tax to pay for our metro system, building, I think it's 16 lines. I'm not our transportation person in our office, so I feel like I'm speaking way out of turn. But with the 2020 Olympics coming up, there's a real drive to complete a lot of that work and really get people out of cars sooner rather than later. Some of the things that we're doing that aren't probably different than anybody else, either governments or private businesses, is a lot of flexible work schedules, 980s all over the place at the county, a lot of focus on first mile, last mile, built within Measure M's funding, so a big chunk of money to figure out how to get people where they need to be. A huge part of LA is on a grid, and it's really, that last mile is tough. We've had this infusion of those scooters, the birds, and everything like that, which, depending on who you ask, are either wonderful or terrible. So I think that there's a lot of creative things that are happening around, that technology, bike shares, things like that. So I don't have a whole lot to add. I think electrification is a really big piece of what we're trying to do. Particularly for a lot of our bus fleets in Metro. So my boss is the chair of the board of Metro, which is the transit agency for the region. And there's a gap between what we'd like to do and the technology, and it's just not quite there yet for a lot of the lines to go full electric yet. And so we're sort of making commitments to get there before the technology is actually there, hoping that the market catches up with us. And that, I think, is something that's important to be doing, because we're big enough that we can drive the market, but it's a little bit nerve-wracking to be saying we're going to be 100% electric fleet by X year, and the technology's not there yet, especially given the short time frame for committing to get there.
Just that last comment, we adopted this 100% renewable electricity goal 4 years ago. We've been talking about it for several years before that. And the conversation was really around, when I first started bringing that up and trying to organize to get that passed, was 100% electricity is not possible. You just can't get there. You can't do it. I can't tell you how many economic professors and engineers came out to lecture me on what a silly idea this was, let alone a lot of politicians. And within just 4 or 5 years, by putting out that ambitious target, kind of similar to what you're saying, the conversation has shifted to how we're going to get there. Okay, how are we going to get there? And people just stop saying that, stop saying it's not possible. The market catches up. The data actually showed we weren't really that far away to begin with. And the targets are usually 2025, 2030, 2035. You have time to actually catch up. I have found that to be a really interesting piece of my work, is seeing that dialogue change as we push forward these big policies. And the naysayers eventually fade away just by kind of holding your line and moving that initiative forward. It takes a little bit of courage and political will, but it's kind of fun to watch that happen.
In LA, LADWP is recently committed to moving off coal entirely, and the Community Choice Energy Program in LA County is moving in the same direction. But this electrification conversation, it doesn't matter if you electrify if your power source is not renewable. And so, one of our biggest challenges is figuring out how to get it there quickly so that we can still meet, our underlying goals, which is, greenhouse gas reduction. So people talk about electrification as if that's the end game, but it's actually it's a step beyond that. And so there are a couple things that need to be happening at the same time to make that actually a goal worth achieving.
Just to get a sense, do folks in the crowd have questions for the speakers? Okay. Well, I have one more. I just want to get a sense of where people are at to make sure I save time for that. One thing that's interesting, I would like to hear your opinions on, is what we've seen with offsets is that there's been a reaction from the environmental justice community that they feel like they've been left out. And there's been another reaction in the definition of that environmental justice community from the rural areas in California. And I guess I'm speaking specifically to California, but maybe not. We can broaden it to social equity. How, in your investments and your activities, are you ensuring, and Tanya, you started to touch on this, but how are you addressing issues of social equity with your work?
So, there's sort of procedural inclusion and equity when you're developing something, figuring out how to make sure that people who aren't normally at the table are at the table. So, for example, with the draft sustainability plan that the counties put out, they paid stipends to 150 community-based organizations to come to the events and come to the meetings and weigh in and provide input before a word was drafted of the plan. And when you have capacity issues at smaller organizations, paying to have people show up is really important because otherwise they might not be able to even come. So I think actively soliciting participation and recognizing that sometimes you need to pay for people's time is really important. And then I think that making sure that you're thinking about green jobs and just transition and jobs training programs have to be part of any conversation about a move to a sustainable economy. So our sustainability plan has targets and goals around all of that in there too. And in all of our funding measures that we've recently passed, Measure M for transportation, Measure A for parks, and our Measure W, which is our stormwater funding measure, they all have money set aside for job training programs and really sort of making sure that the people who are doing the work are coming out of the communities that have been sort of disproportionately impacted over the last 100+ years by the way we've structured our land use decisions and transportation decisions and et cetera. So that's kind of how we're, at least in part, thinking about it.
I think I touched on this a little bit, but we also just hired our first equity specialist in the city to focus on the nexus of sustainability and equity. And his first task, one, is to find a whole bunch more money and resources because one person is not enough. And two is really to help us define what that means, because when you go around even internally to our city and say, oh, I'm going to work on equity, it means 18 different things to different people, or you get the eye roll of like, why are we having to talk about this, or the discomfort because it's sometimes an uncomfortable feeling for people. There's so many, it's such a big, sticky issue, and I'm finding a lot of people don't have the understanding or baseline knowledge to even really tackle it, or they think they do, and then they're like, oh great, we'll just go talk to this community and tell them what we're going to do, and then we check the box of being equitable, and that's also failing. And so we're really trying to work through what that definition looks like and how do we tackle that, and then how do we broaden that out across the city and do better. And it's so huge, and I think for where we're headed, I envision it'll be its own entire program soon, but I'm just kind of incubating it at this point because I have some political will to do so.
So I think I would just like to add that when we talk about social equity, obviously we're talking about justice, fairness, and I think that all the public policies have to have very clear indicators on how you're going to achieve that with the programs or the policies that you're implementing. And obviously the participation is very important. By law in Mexico and Mexico City, practically any climate action or anything that you want to publish and officialize has to go through this very participative process. But yes, I think that, recognizing that people's time has a cost, and being willing to pay for that can incentivize that. It can be kind of tricky also, know who you pay and who's so, but it's an interesting approach. So I think that, and sometimes a lot of the challenges we face as governments is how do you just, really make it public and people be aware that there is going to be this process where they can comment and they can be included. And that's something that I think today with social networks really can help you, something that we did that I think was very interesting towards the end is that we did a study of social impact on our public park infrastructure. So, normally governments will say, well, we remade or we renovated this park. Now it has lighting, it has a skate park, everything's nice and secure. But what is that social impact having in the community? And that was done by a very interesting consulting group, Happy Cities, where obviously there was a quantitative evaluation on their behalf that was very technical, but there was also a social evaluation on behalf of the users of these public spaces. And I think that's something we have to take more into account when we're talking about social equity, fairness, justice, are the users of public spaces, and many of our public spaces in Mexico City are these urban forests, which are Chapultepec, which is similar to Central Park. What is the social impact of the infrastructure and the green infrastructure you're building?
Well, thank you for that. And now I'd like to go to the audience, and would you like to?
Actually, you asked the question I was going to ask right then and there, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
What kind of metrics was Happy City tracking for quantitative responses from?
They would evaluate technically, for example, if the, to give you an example, the skate park had gender inclusiveness, because they saw that, for example, in Amsterdam, many of the public parks in the more vulnerable areas of the city, there were very little, or there was a gender inequality because of the insecurity. But qualitatively, they would ask the users how secure they felt, if they felt that there was a space where they could do community engagement, resiliency, which is kind of tricky because how many people really understand, what resilience is? If you go out right now into a public park and you say, do you feel this space is resilient? So we didn't totally agree on that one, but it was their methodology. But it was very interesting at the end to really see how the users evaluated these renovated spaces in public space. So it's online, and there's a executive version in English. If you want to. Well, it's on the webpage of the Secretary of Environment of Mexico City, and I guess if you go online and just put on. So the evaluation is in Spanish, but I think if you put in Happy Cities, it should come up, yeah, if they haven't taken it down yet. So Mexico City is divided, the mayor is elected, which is like a governor, because he doesn't have, like after him, it's directly, he deals with the president, even though, but Mexico City is divided into 16, I guess, what would you call the alcaldías, like municipalities? And they're also each elected, no? So that's a huge part of coordination that has to be done, and they're from different parties. It's mostly bipartisan, so either left or right. The city, Mexico City, for the last 20 years has been more left, or no, a left government. So obviously that helps, but even within the same left parties, within the 16 municipalities, there's so many political interests. You know, they each want to become governor of Mexico City, or they want to become senator, or then they want to be a congressman. So that doesn't mean they're always aligned. In climate change, what we did, and I think that was interesting, is that Mexico City published its climate action plan, but then by law, we said that each municipality had to have their own, but it would be coordinated by the Ministry of Environment. So we basically told them, this is the city's plan, and if you're a municipality who has more conservation land, these are the actions that you should prioritize if they're, so we did give them some flexibility, but we really also were on top of them, you know, just seeing that they would do this compliance with the city's climate action plan. So I think, yeah, political things are always tricky everywhere because there's so many different agendas, no?
We have two parties, Democrat and Republican, primarily, right? Do you have multiple?
We have multiple, but the city really is, you'll have the PRI, and two left, or like maybe two right and two left. So in total, you'll be dealing with like 4 very strong political parties within the city, basically.
Okay. We do have a question? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're dealing with this now at the county, and it's interesting. You compare and contrast with the city of LA, where Mayor García has his Plan LA, which isn't codified anywhere. It's just his vision for environmentalism, and it works as long as he's mayor. But the council hasn't adopted it and made it law. So what we're going to try and do at the county, what we will do at the county, is push through the sustainability plan, which will include a climate action plan and sort of tiers of different water plan and things like that, and sort of institutionalize and codify it. One of the things we've done is tie department head reviews to how well they're carrying out their sustainability mandates. So we've broken it out by department, and hopefully, I mean, that could change, I guess. It could take that out after supervisors leave. So that's one thing to do. The other thing that we've tried to do is build things that are hard to take apart, and that where there's like a value proposition that people like. So the Clean Power Alliance, for example, has over 1 million customers now. And so that's not going to go anywhere. I mean, my boss will be replaced at some point as the county rep on the board, but that's there and it's going to stay. Measure W is an ongoing funding stream that is in perpetuity that will pay for these sorts of projects, and we're very prescriptive in creating the ordinance that was adopted as to what that money could be used for. It has to be used, largely for multi-benefit green infrastructure projects. So what we tried to do was, keeping that in mind, because we have a very progressive board now, we won't forever, how do we build in pieces of it that sort of will be very hard to take apart?
I could add a little bit to that. So when we drafted our climate action plan, and it was, again, very ambitious at the time, it was a Democratic mayor who initially drafted it, and he's pretty left-leaning, he's very progressive, and when it transitioned, it didn't get adopted before he was out of office. He was actually an interim mayor because we had a previous very progressive mayor who turned out to be molesting women, and it was a little bit of a bit of a problem for us. So we went through an interim mayor who just cranked up the dial on this draft climate action plan we had and put all the goals really high, and then elected the Republican mayor that we have now. And that was the potential to lose all momentum. And everybody kind of assumed that would happen. All of our stakeholders thought, this is game over for us. And we really worked on that transition and worked with our mayor to understand what his base is and who his supporters are, and bring them along. And that's what he said too. He said, I'm coming in, I'm happy to keep this plan going if you can get my base on board. And that was the first 8 or 9 months of my job, was really working to that end and really focusing on the business community and making sure that they found something that they could support or like in that plan as well. And we made some small adjustments, but nothing really substantial to bring down the goals. A couple other ideas and kind of tips and tricks we used was to make the plan legally binding once we adopted it. So going forward, that kind of future-proofs it a little bit from many other political changes. Another thing we do is, and I think this might be a little harder in LA because it's so geographically big and disparate, is we have a really strong advocacy group or space in San Diego, and a lot of advocates that can coalesce fairly easily. They still don't always agree on everything, and they focus sometimes on our city more than others, but they create a loud voice that really helps put pressure, and so working with them. I don't know how that works here, but cultivating those that are helpful advocates is always a good way to go.
Is that okay? So for Measure W, which was incredibly complicated because the cities were focused on stormwater compliance, and so they wanted to do a certain thing, and the NGOs wanted to do a variety of different things. We actually had a foundation, the Water Foundation, step in and fund sort of the creation of Our Water LA, which was a coalition, ended up being a coalition of about 80 environmental and community-based NGOs, to really, sort of surface and elevate issues that were common and sort of common goals, and those were embedded into Measure W. But the cool thing is that the Our Water LA coalition continues to exist, and we rely on them as allies and sort of information. They can help push politically, they can help disseminate information, provide education, and so that coalition is now alive, even though the foundation's funding for the position is maybe like a part-time person still. So you can really leverage minimal foundation dollars to help organize those groups, and they help hugely on political will.
We're down to the last couple of minutes here, and one thing that was said during the plenary today is by Annie from NRDC is that the vacuum invites action, and she was referring to the vacuum at the federal level. And maybe it's harder for Mexico. Mexico is moving forward with their climate plans, but I'm wondering if you can just give a couple quick comments on what that means to you. Are you letting the vacuum at the federal level holding you up, and Tanya, you can adapt it?
Yeah, I think it's like being a kid in the candy store. It's sort of like, think about what you want to do and then you can do it, because there's very little getting in the way of you doing it if you have the political will. And fortunately in LA County right now we do. So in some ways, I mean, it's a tragedy that it's not happening at the federal level, and we can't rely on federal dollars for a lot of the stuff that we might otherwise, but a lot of interesting policy is happening at the local level.
Yeah, I think climate action is local action no matter what the federal government does. So it's kind of always been that way. And it's really just driven some more attention and resources to the local level, which is really helpful for us. Also being on the border with Mexico and having, again, it's a broken record here, but a Republican mayor, we've had some interesting conversations around the federal Republican positions and then a local Republican position on a variety of things, including climate change and relationships with border crossing in Mexico and the economy. And we've had to think long and hard about how we want to respond to those things, and our mayor has really balanced that and has taken a position against the federal actions on a variety of issues, including the border wall and trade and climate change. So it's been really interesting, I think, to have that conversation. But definitely bringing resources and attention to the local level has actually been helpful, sadly.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think definitely worldwide cities have always been very progressive, and set many policies in place that maybe at the national level aren't happening. I do think that in the case of Mexico, this is an historic moment where the president has the majority in the Senate, in the Congress, in 19 local Congresses. So there's really a huge opportunity to push forward the environmental agenda if there's the understanding that the most vulnerable socially are also those most vulnerable environmentally, and that there is a link that you cannot break between the environment and the social aspect.
We'll wrap it up on that. Beautiful last. So I'd like to thank the panelists.